At 9:45 a.m., Russian fighters roared to life. Interceptors shot down the runway, climbing hard into the chilly sky. Their mission: simple in words but intense in execution. Intercept, identify, deter. Nothing more, nothing less. By 9:48 a.m., the NATO crew was on high alert. Inside their aircraft, warning systems chirp softly, signaling new contacts moving fast. Fast forward to 9:43 a.m., and the first detection pops up, hundreds of kilometers away. Russian air defense radar picked up the contact in an instant. The radar lit up, revealing a large signal, unmistakably NATO. By 10:19 a.m., NATO escorts were still in the picture. The NATO fighters were right there with the patrol aircraft, forming a tight, protective shield. No chasing, no victory laps, just a solid show of professionalism. Then, at 10:22, everything unfolded with a sense of calm, leaving everyone curious about what might happen next. Inside a Russian Air Defense Command Center, the atmosphere was tense. An officer leaned forward, eyes glued to the screen. NATO ISR aircraft. Track confirmed. The response was swift and decisive. Scramble interceptors. At 9:45 a.m., Russian fighters roared to life. Interceptors shot down the runway, climbing hard into the chilly sky. Their mission: simple in words but intense in execution. Intercept, identify, deter. Nothing more, nothing less. By 9:48 a.m., the NATO crew was on high alert. Inside their aircraft, warning systems chirped softly, signaling new contacts moving fast. Fast forward to 9:43 a.m., and the first detection pops up, hundreds of kilometers away. Russian air defense radar picked up the contact in an instant. The radar lit up, revealing a large signal, unmistakably NATO. Inside a Russian Air Defense Command Center, the atmosphere was tense. An officer leaned forward, eyes glued to the screen. NATO ISR aircraft. Track confirmed. The response was swift and decisive. Scramble interceptors. At 9:45 a.m., Russian fighters roared to life. Interceptors shot down the runway, climbing hard into the chilly sky. Their mission: simple in words but intense in execution. Intercept, identify, deter. Nothing more, nothing less. By 9:48 a.m., the NATO crew was on high alert. Inside their aircraft, warning systems chirped softly, signaling new contacts moving fast. Movers closing. The aircraft commander remained calm. Russian fighters inbound. Maintain course. Record everything. This wasn't the first intercept, but something about the closure rate felt different. 9:50 a.m. Visual contact. The first Russian interceptor slid into view. Sleek, aggressive, close enough for the crew to see the pilot's helmet. Too close. The second aircraft positioned itself slightly below and behind the NATO plane, boxing it in. A textbook intimidation maneuver. 952A.M. Unsafe proximity. The Russian lead fighter edged even closer. Inside the NATO cockpit, a sensor operator muttered under his breath. He's inside minimum separation. Cameras recorded every movement. This wasn't routine shadowing anymore. 9:53 a.m. Radio silence. The NATO aircraft transmitted calmly. Russian military aircraft. You are operating in international airspace. Maintain safe distance. No response. The Russian fighters stayed silent deliberately. 9:55 a.m. First aggressive move. Without warning, the Russian interceptor surged ahead, crossed directly in front of the NATO aircraft, and pulled up sharply, forcing wake turbulence across the NATO jet's wings. Alarms chirped. The aircraft rocked. Inside Russian command, the maneuver was noted. Pilot asserting dominance. Inside NATO command, the assessment was colder. This is unsafe. 9:57 a.m. Weapon status changes. A subtle shift occurred. NATO sensors detected the Russian fighter weapon system transitioning. Not locked, not fired, but armed. The difference was crucial. 9:58 a.m. The warning shots. Then it happened. The Russian interceptor rolled slightly, dropped its nose, and fired. Short bursts. Tracer rounds streaked through empty air, well ahead of the NATO aircraft's nose. They didn't hit. They weren't meant to, but they were unmistakable. 9:59 a.m. Shock in the cockpit. Inside the NATO aircraft, alarm screamed. Not missile warnings, gunfire, proximity alerts. The aircraft commander clenched his jaw. They fired. Record time stamp. This crossed a line. 10 a.m. Command reaction at NATO Air Command. The room went silent. Weapons had been discharged. That changed everything. Confirm live fire confirmed. Warning shots, a pause. Then escalation protocols in effect. 10:01 a.m. Fighters scrambled at a nearby NATO airbase. Pilots already on alert sprinted for their aircraft. Engines spooled, runways cleared. This was no longer an observation mission. 10:02 a.m. Russian fighters press in. The Russian interceptor tightened its turn, sliding even closer. The second fighter maneuvered into a more aggressive escort position. They weren't disengaging, they were doubling down. 10:03 a.m. The NATO aircraft holds course. Against instinct, the NATO aircraft did not turn away, turning now would signal retreat, and retreat could invite pursuit. The crew held steady, hands hovered near emergency switches. 10:04 a.m. Something changes on radar. Both Russian pilots noticed it at the same time. New contacts, fast, high, approaching from the west. NATO fighters. 10:05 a.m. Escalation confirmed. Inside Russian command, the update came in sharp and fast. NATO fighters airborne multiple. The response was immediate. Maintain intercept. Do not disengage. 10:06 a.m. The sky tightens. 4 aircraft now converged on a small patch of airspace. To Russian interceptors. 1 NATO patrol aircraft. To NATO fighters closing fast. No room for mistakes. No room for bravado. 10:07 a.m. Cliffhanger. As the NATO fighters closed to visual range, the Russian lead interceptor received a new directive, short, urgent, authorized escalation phase. At the same moment, a NATO pilot heard a tone he never wanted to hear. A radar warning spike. Weapons were no longer just armed. They were being aimed. 10:08 a.m. Visual merge. The first NATO fighter broke through the cloud layer at high speed, its silhouette unmistakable against the pale northern sky. Seconds later, the second fighter slid into formation, positioning itself slightly above and behind the NATO patrol aircraft. This was not accidental. This was protection, inside. The NATO fighter cockpit, the pilot spoke calmly. NATO aircraft, this is Guardian 1. We are on your wing. The patrol aircraft crew exhaled just slightly. They were no longer alone. At 10:09 a.m., Russian reaction. The Russian lead interceptor immediately adjusted course, climbing to match the NATO fighter altitude. The second Russian jet drifted outward, widening the formation. 4 fighters now shared a dangerously small volume of airspace. Every movement was deliberate. Every meter mattered. 10:10 a.m. Radar locks. Multiply. Inside the NATO fighter cockpit, a sharp tone pulsed again. Radar illumination. Not a missile lock, but close enough to feel personal. The pilot responded instantly. Spike detected. Russian aircraft illuminating. His wingman confirmed the same. To NATO fighters were now being painted. 10:11 a.m. NATO rules of engagement shift at NATO Air Command. Legal advisors and commanders moved fast. Weapons had been fired. Radar locks were active. NATO aircraft were threatened. The ruling was clear. Defensive postures authorized. No. First fire. The message reached the pilot seconds later. You are cleared to maneuver defensively. Do not escalate unless fired upon. 10:12 a.m. Close pass. The Russian lead interceptor suddenly rolled left and sliced between the NATO patrol aircraft and its escorting fighter, passing within meters. Shock waves rattled both cockpits. This was no longer signaling. This was provocation. 10:13 a.m. NATO holds discipline. Despite the aggression, NATO pilots held their nerve. No missiles armed, no counterlocks, no sudden turns. They matched speed, matched altitude, denied the Russians any excuse. 10:14 a.m. A new factor appears. Far below, unseen by the pilots, but very visible to command centers, a NATO naval radar picked up the entire engagement. A destroyer in international waters adjusted its sensors upward. Data began flowing. Sea, air, and command were now linked. 10:15 a.m. Russian command reconsider. Inside the Russian Air Command Center, the tone shifted. NATO fighters were not backing off. Naval assets were watching. Everything was recorded. An officer spoke carefully. This is becoming visible. Visibility meant consequences. 10:16 a.m. Final warning. The Russian lead interceptor transmitted for the first time. Short, cold. NATO aircraft. Alter course immediately. The NATO fighter pilot replied just as calmly, negative. Operating lawfully in international airspace. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. 10:17 a.m. Weapon systems cooled down on NATO sensors. Something changed. The radar illumination weakened then. By 10:19 a.m., NATO escorts were still in the picture. The NATO fighters were right there with the patrol aircraft, forming a tight, protective shield. No chasing. No victory laps, just a solid show of professionalism. Then, at 10:22, everything unfolded with a sense of calm, leaving everyone curious about what might happen next. By 10:19 a.m., NATO escorts were still in the mix. The NATO fighters stayed close to the patrol aircraft, keeping a tight, protective formation. There was no pursuit. No victory lap, just a display of professionalism. Then, at 10:22, the scene unfolded with a sense of calm, leaving everyone to wonder what would happen next. Crisis averted without a single shot fired. Just minutes later, radar screens confirmed that Russian interceptors had left the area, and the NATO patrol continued its mission. The sky was quiet once more. Hours later, diplomatic channels buzzed with activity. Formal protests were exchanged, radar data scrutinized, and gun camera footage analyzed frame by frame. Public statements were crafted with care, but behind closed doors, everyone grasped the reality. A line had been crossed, but thankfully, it was narrowly stepped back from. In the end, warning shots are not just a precaution, they're a reminder of the delicate balance we navigate. Warnings are messages, right? In this situation, both sides got the message loud and clear. Modern warfare isn't just about who takes the first shot. It's really about who can manage the escalation. On this day, high above the cold international skies, that control was hanging by a thread.